Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat Worlds Crusade. You rejoin us at a rather busy time for the War Master's men, as the years 768 and 769 were a period during which the War Master's chase for the horizon was starting to look a little foolhardy. Ironic, really. Initially, everyone had declared the War Master mad for his over-ambitious general offensive, but then it started gaining ground, and everybody calmed down, assuming the War Master really did know what he was doing here. The general perception soon became that the Crusade would hammer its way relentlessly through the final line of Chaos defenders, whatever fallback line Archon Nalzibar had established before his defeat at Balhat. It was likely to be brittle, thin, and the only areas where true resistance was expected were those in which his previous lieutenants had gone to ground. People like Magister Rushek Vakim, for example, the person responsible for the destruction of Tarnith. Or Sholan Skara, the man behind the murder camps on Balhat, and the leader of the dreaded fanatical corn-worshipping Kith. But the rest of the Chaos forces would in essence be garrison troops, placed out as a fallback or tertiary defensive line, rear guard units organized by the Archon before his defeat at Balhat, a defeat of course the Archon did not see coming. Therefore, it seemed extremely unlikely that he had managed to organize any sort of a contingency plan in case of his own defeat. There was, in other words, probably only a brittle line of Chaos defenders between the Imperium and a general breakthrough. And with the War Master applying pressure to the entire front at once, surely a shattering victory was only a matter of time. Unfortunately, that assumption, more and more, was starting to appear incorrect. The Crusade's massed offensive had gained significant ground early on, and was still moving forward, but the enemy resistance continued. On every world the Imperium reached, there were organized, dug in, and prepared defenders, usually of a cultist form, massed hordes of chaos-worshipping madmen, occasionally the retinues of powerful magisters, and slowly but surely increasing in quantity, a grouping of enemies designated the Blood Pact. Now, they had already been encountered sporadically in the early days of the Crusade, but usually in small numbers, and usually operating independently from the majority of the Chaos host, like private armies, or more correctly, independent fire brigades. Now, this fact alone had earned them the attention of Imperial intelligence and the Inquisition, as usually Chaos forces are not organized enough to be operating with that degree of autonomy, at the very least, not without the various forces running into each other's way and causing more headache for one another than for Imperial commanders. Yet this Blood Pact appeared not only to be capable of operating with this degree of independence, but also, more worryingly, with what appeared to be a great deal of personal initiative. Tactically and strategically educated initiative as well. See, again, when a Chaos war host is splintered for whatever reason, the loss of its leader, for example, then the various warbands scattered across the battlefield will invariably be taken over by strongmen leaders, whoever has the greatest favor of the gods, whoever is the most charismatic, or whoever is simply the strongest, will rise to a position of primacy. After which point, they by and large simply pursue whatever personal designs they may have. But practically never do these have anything to do with any other warbands. Indeed, the majority of these petty leaders will view other warbands as great a threat to them as the armies of the Emperor, as these petty despots don't really care over much about the grander tactical designs of the campaign or the wider strategies of the Sabbat Worlds. They're in this for personal prestige and personal gain. Thus, cooperation is a rarity. But the Blood Pact was something completely different. Even the smaller groupings, individual squads or platooned, were noted to always move with a grander purpose, as if they knew and understood a wider battlefield strategy. Now, again, merely just the capability of comprehending wider scale strategy is a rarity within the Chaos Warhost, made up primarily of corrupted civilians or the occasional fallen guardsman. Yet, that was exactly what the Blood Pact was doing. Furthermore, they also seemed to understand the qualities of other Chaos forces. On repeated occasions, the Blood Pact were observed essentially herding cultists out ahead of themselves to protect their own troops as living shields, as a part of a grander escalation, where Imperial Guard forces would waste the majority of their attention and ammunition on cannon fodder, only to be overrun in precise escalated grenade and bayonet charges. The Blood Pact also combined this tactical acumen with the fanaticism of true believers, willing and able to carry out acts of endurance that only a religious madman would be capable of, and throw themselves at heavy weapons positions without a second thought, just to buy a comrade with a demolition charge another 2 or 3 meters with which to get closer and hurl it against the enemy emplacement. Fortunately for the Imperium, the Blood Pact appeared to be a very small yet highly organized warband, presumed to be the private retinue of some remarkably unusual Chaos warlord. A magister, in all due likelihood, one of Nadzibar's lieutenants, and their numbers thus were expected to be no more than 10-20,000 at most. A tactical danger, absolutely, but strategically irrelevant. The increasing numbers of Blood Pact sightings in these years were worrying, especially as the Imperial Crusade was stretched to its absolute limit, but they were still expected to be, at the end of the day, a non-strategic threat. Far worse were the various Chaos Magisters. The battle for the world of Bucephalon, for example, leaps to mind. It had been targeted by significant Imperial Guard forces due to rumors that one of the Archon's Magisters, Knockard the Smiling, had gone to ground on the world. This was to be a manhunt, then, in essence, to track down and kill the Magister. But again, the Imperium had underestimated the resilience of their opposition, and what they had thought to be a running, scattered, frightened foe turned out to be anything but. The Imperial Guard had overstretched, on a microcosm compared to the Crusade at large, of course, but nevertheless the similarities are striking in their pursuit of Knockard the Smiling. The Magister had organized an enormous number of Chaos cultists and had managed to keep them quiet and hidden in major urban centers. Once the Imperial Guard had landed and spread out sufficiently, he launched these hundreds of thousands of cultist fanatics against the Guard, threatening to overrun and completely destroy several regiments, the Tarnished First and Only being amongst them. Having been one of the leading forces in the search for the Magister, Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt's regiment was caught at the forefront of the counter-offensive. His lines were shattered almost immediately. Isolated islands of Tarnith resistance were trying to hold off a seemingly inevitable and unending wave of cultists, rising before them like a wave threatening to wash away and drown the entire regiment. The casualties were already mounting at a disturbing pace, and within half an hour, the entire regiment would have been slaughtered. And with it, probably a significant portion of the Imperial Guard forces, as this counteroffensive bore almost every hallmark of another Parthenop-level disaster. A cleverly organized, expertly executed, and massive ambush on a planetary level. Until Nakard the Smiling, leading the charge, carrying an enormous banner with him, surrounded by his bodyguard, fell, his head blown open by a hotshot las round fired by a Tarnith sniper. The hero in question's name was Helene Larkin. The Colonel Commissar had assumed the sniper to have deserted mere minutes before. Having seen the onrushing tide, the sniper had apparently turned and ran away from the battle. The Commissar had briefly considered simply shooting him in the back, and would almost certainly have done so as well, were it not for the fact that a few thousand cultists baying for his blood seemed like a better target for his bolt rounds at the time. An excellent decision, it turned out, as the sniper was not in fact running away, but seeking an elevated position. Presumably he had managed to spot the Smiling at a distance, or spy his banner, or perhaps some tingle, some sniper's instinct had driven him into a old, abandoned and near destroyed, bombed out temple of the Emperor. Ensconced within, he had cradled his long lass with its beautiful gnarlwood finish and executed a perfect long-range execution shot on the enemy commander. The moment he died, his men panicked. Their leader, their reason for existence, their beacon, their connection to the gods, dead. They halted their assault. Many simply fell down on their knees, screaming and crying. Others milled around, and yet further began to flee. Easy prey for the Tarnith and the other Imperial Guard regiments. Now, admittedly, there might be more to this story, as it seems like what we would often refer to as a God-Emperor-given miracle, and mayhaps it was. But the Guard needs its heroes, and Helene Larkin on this day was it. No need to sully his achievement with any further suspicion of desertion, right? Although it would certainly not be the only opportunity for heroism that the Tarnith would experience during this period, as their regiment were thrown back and forth into fight after fight, just like many other regiments at the time who were, moved from one fire to the next in order to make sure that various sporadic chaos counteroffensives and raiding fleets could not gain too much ground. The agri-world of Nasaon was just such an example. Originally, the world had been a prize world, won by an Imperial regiment who was then later on allowed to settle it many generations ago, and had by all accounts remained loyal to the Imperium, until a Chaos raiding fleet assaulted the world. They were probably looking to raid its agricultural riches and then leave as quickly as possible. However, this raiding fleet was then engaged by an Imperial Navy element, along with its contingent guard forces. The two sides got so intermingled that there was no retreating for either one. Further Chaos forces arrived, necessitating the arrival of further Imperial Guard forces, necessitating the arrival of yet more Chaos forces, and so on, until what had started as, in essence, a strategic-level skirmish turned into a full-scale war, and a remarkably frantic one as well. With both sides throwing in whatever reinforcement was available, there was no front line. Just more or less mobile formations of Guard and/or Chaos forces ravaging the countryside, with varying objectives. Some forces were attempting to hunt down others, some were attempting to raid, some were attempting to extract themselves with what they had already raided. Yet others again were simply maneuvering for tactical superiority. In the midst of all of this madness, the Tarnith were caught yet again in the teeth of a major Chaos offensive, along with the Vulpan 50th, the Blue Bloods. You may remember that the Tarnith had run-ins with the Vulpan before, and their general Notches Sturm, including the Quetzalcoatl self-propelled artillery regiment and an unfortunate case of blue on blue. The Tarnith had unsurprisingly not forgiven the Blue Bloods for that, and the Blue Bloods had not forgiven the Tarnith for, well, in their view, stealing their glory. And so the two forces being caught on the retreat together, well, that could very easily have ended quite poorly, but yet again, luckily, both sides had more pressing things to shoot at than one another. Though during the retreat there was yet another remarkable event, where a mixed contingent of Tarnith and Blue Bloods stayed behind the retreating Imperial Guard columns to defend a small farmhouse. Why? Because it was occupied by a large number of non-walking wounded, both from the Blue Bloods and from the Tarnith. The wounded had been ordered to be abandoned, because there was no stopping now. There was a major Chaos counteroffensive rumbling this way. Halting would be suicide. Furthermore, if major regimental forces stopped here, that would only attract yet further Chaos forces. As counterintuitive as it might sound, the wounded's best chance of survival were to be abandoned, hoping that the pursuing Chaos troops would miss them in their small isolated farmhouse. This was a practical decision, virtually the only one as well, but almost made into a very expensive one, as apparently the Tarnith chief medic, one Tolin Dorden, a local county doctor, according to his paperwork, before the founding of the Tarnith First and Now Only, well, he demanded to be left behind to see to the wounded. Admirable, to be sure, but that would also rob the entire regiment of their chief surgeon and medical officer. Oh well, for some reason or another, Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt didn't simply hit him over the head and drag him away, the only reasonable decision in this scenario. Instead, he elected to leave him behind with a small contingent of ghosts, further doubling down on his losses, it would seem. The God Emperor, though, has apparently taken quite a shine to the Tarnith First and Only, as the Tarnith volunteers and the lighter wounded Vulpan miraculously managed to hold off the first wave of Chaos forces. Light, advanced scouts in all due likelihood, judging by the lack of armor or direct support. They inflicted such casualties upon them that instead of attempting to storm the farmhouse, they brought up light field pieces to bombard it, at which point the wounded, the Tarnith, the Vulpin, and the Doctor retreated down into the farmhouse's cellar, which had been built remarkably strong by, well, previous generations who had, it just so happened, descended from the Imperial Guard regiments that had claimed the world. Perhaps one of them had been a bit of a survivalist, and had built his cellar extra sturdy. As the next morning, when the Imperial counteroffensive retook the ground, the Tarnith, the Vulpin, and the Doctor all emerged from the ruins of the farmhouse, more or less intact. And that wasn't even the most absurd piece of God Emperor granted luck that the Tarnith enjoyed in these years. Oh no, that honor goes to the action at Sapienka. This was an ocean world. The only reason it was inhabited at all was because the lips of enormous craters formed by submerged supervolcanoes provided just about enough land for civilization to sprout, and access to tremendous quantities of promethium. A resource that the Crusade was now beginning to get really desperate for. Not because the Crusade didn't have enough promethium, the supplies were still coming in from the neighboring sector, but the logisticians had not expected this much maneuver warfare. They had never in their wildest dreams expected that they would need to rush regiments back and forth here and there to respond to countless threats constantly. The Crusade's reserves were being refilled, but they were draining quicker than they were being replenished, and so local sources needed to be found, and quickly. Thus, the Imperial Guard were ordered to invade this ocean world, despite the fact that it was going to be a nightmare. Orbital landers would have to fly down directly on top of enormously heavily fortified, well, crater rims, bristling with guns and 30 meters tall curtain walls. There were barely even any beaches to set the guard forces down on, to the point where many of the Mars landers couldn't find anywhere to deploy their troops, and so they arrived at their designated positions, opened their assault ramps, and dumped the guardsmen straight down into the ocean. The Tarnith, first and only, survived this as well as any Imperial Guard regiment can survive, being unceremoniously dumped into a planet-spanning ocean, whereas their allies in the first-line assault, the Quetzalcoatl Armored Regiment, well, I'll leave it to you to imagine how well a tank swims. 9 times out of 10, both regiments would have been wiped out right there, were it not for the enormous luminescent beams of sunlight shining down from he on Earth's arse and straight down onto Trooper Catherine, or the Tarnith first and only. As first, a mass transport smashed into the curtain walls, creating an enormous rent in the walls through which only Trooper Catherine and a handful of Tarnith troopers managed to get through before it was filled by Kith attackers. As this, Sapienka, was the hidey hole of Sholan Skara and his fanatical cornered cultists. Trooper Catherine, now in de facto command of this small infiltration unit, saw no particular reason to stick around, and instead began to head deeper within the complex, hoping maybe to find a gate to open, or a munitions dump to detonate, or anything really. There wasn't too much of a plan, but, he was in, so might as well advance, right? Well, he encountered Kith forces deeper within the complexes, and engaged in running skirmishes with these Chaos troops. Knowing that he was horrifically outnumbered, completely surrounded and utterly cut off, Catherine continued these skirmishes, moving away, hitting whatever he could, and engaging other forces. This painted a picture to Sholan Skara sitting at the heart of his defenses as the great big disgusting spider of what appeared to be an Imperial Guard penetration of his defenses. He must of course have been aware of the rent in the outer walls and had now clearly assumed that the Imperial Guard was flooding in and that defeat was mere hours away. So, to deny the Imperium its victory, Sholan Skara ordered the Kith to begin falling back to central locations, where they would begin mass executions of their own men. 10 cultists would move up and be shot by the 10 cultists behind them, who would then move up and be shot by the next 10 cultists behind them. And all of this was happening as Trooper Catherine and his tiny handful of scared and bedraggled infiltrators were watching. They even saw Sholan Skara himself, and, well, there was the idea that should we attack? Should we try to kill him? And Catherine simply just holds up his hands and go, no, 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 let them cook. And so they did. Sholan Skara quite literally defeated himself, as now that the walls were no longer manned by the full force of the Kith defenders, the Imperial Guard actually did manage to land and penetrate the walls, moving in to find virtually no resistance left. Sholan Skara himself was eventually captured and denied his death as one last little insult. In all of humanity's long, vociferous, and aggressive history of violence and warfare, I am not entirely sure we've ever seen the likes of this luck. Not that the Tarnith didn't deserve it, though, mind you, they did provide a valuable service to the Crusade in this period, even against non-chaos enemies, as the Tarnith were one of several lighter regiments that were dispatched to the Sabbat Worlds' southern areas, to the ice world of Typhon, where the soldiers of the Imperial Guard, the Tarnith first amongst them, would go up not against yet further maddened zealous heretics, but a very different kind of crazy. Orc crazy. For naturally, being an ice world, Typhon did not support much in the way of Imperial civilization. By and large, ice worlds are not particularly hospitable, and usually when there is actually some kind of major built-up industry or even civilian infrastructure on these worlds, it is because of the presence of something particularly valuable. Now, Typhon did have enormous subglacial, I suppose, more correctly in this case, oceans of liquid methane. And there were indeed outposts created to extract and refine these chemicals. But that was not the reason why the orcs were attacking Typhon. The orcs were attacking Typhon because they figured it was a shitty enough planet to the point where the Imperium probably wouldn't bother much with it, and it was also not quite so hostile as to discourage them, which might in turn allow Typhon to become a covert forward operating base for other orc raiders. We've talked about this previously. In fact, in one of our earliest videos, we discussed how Imperial intelligence was getting rather worried due to increased orc activity in neighboring systems, and how a major warg right now would be about the worst conceivable scenario for the Imperial Crusade, overstretched as it already was. If an avalanche of greenskins was to smack into its flank, well, that would pretty much spell the end of the Crusade right there. Thus, every measure needed to be taken to discourage the orks. The orks themselves had no real understanding of the strategic situation. It wasn't as if they were pushing into the Sabbat Worlds, noticing some sort of weakness in the Imperial Crusade's plans or anything. They were merely noticing that there was a lot of fighting over there, and there wasn't a lot of border patrols, meaning that it was a nice, open, soft area for their raiding activities. But even though the orks themselves did not have any immediate plans to begin a mass invasion of the Sabbat Worlds, that did not mean that they wouldn't develop one very, very quickly. For, of course, to orks, weakness is a provocation. Thus, if their raiding parties were not sufficiently stopped and their activities halted, more orks would very, very quickly follow. And then more, until there was no effective way of stopping them. And that is why the Tarnith First and Only and other regiments were dispatched to the southern edges of the Sabbat Worlds, to deliver a bloody nose to the Greenskins and to make sure that they got the message that this wasn't quite as unguarded an area as they may have thought. It almost ended with the Colonel Commissar's death as well, at the hands of both an orc and his third-in-command, Elim Rawn, who has already attempted to kill the Colonel Commissar on one previous occasion, but he was an effective third-in-command, I can only imagine, as any other commissar would probably have put a bolt round through this particular individual's insubordinate head by now. But, yet again, the Colonel Commissar and his major got out of it with their lives, largely due to one another as well, as the two were cut off from the rest of the Tarnith First and Only by a sudden orc motorized counterattack that left the two stranded deep behind enemy lines, and were it not for both of their efforts, both of them would probably have been dead. This, incidentally, was probably the single greatest contribution that the Tarnith had made to the war effort so far, as making sure the orcs were not in a position to roll up the Crusade's flanks was of vital strategic importance to the entire Sabbat Worlds Crusade. And as if to reward the Tarnith for their actions, the God Emperor yet again deigned to smile down upon them, as Magister Rushek Vakim, the same Chaos Magister who had destroyed Tarnith and then escaped, was caught in high anchor above the world of Nasaon II, whilst the Hedwak fleet elements were resting and resupplying. They were happened upon by pure coincidence by scouting elements attached to General Urian's fleet moving toward Alpha Madrigo. These fleet elements were not at all suspecting that Rushek Vakim's fleet was in the area. They were not looking for him, they simply noticed high-energy signatures emitting from a planet's orbit which should not have been there, and upon closer inspection, of course, revealed to be an entire fleet. Now, many commanders might have hesitated at the idea of attacking major Chaos forces, even if they had the advantage of surprise. But not General Urians. He was one of Makaroth's newly minted generals, an up-and-comer. Therefore, he had a name to make for himself. Where a more established general might have hesitated at the idea, Urians leapt at it. Wasting no time, he ordered his full force to make all speed towards Nasaon II and launch an immediate attack upon the Hedwak. A risky proposition, as the Chaos fleet force had not been fully scouted, and it very nearly ended in disaster as well, as the two naval elements were roughly equally matched. Both sides tore into one another, and whilst the element of surprise was on the Imperium side, there is only ever so much shock and awe and surprise you can get out of a naval battle, where every side is going to have hours to detect the other and ready themselves for battle. In the end, the fight was concluded and decided in a surprisingly old-fashioned way, with one general seeking out and defeating the other, as General Urians, seeing no doubt that the two fleet forces were evenly matched, elected to launch a boarding attack upon the Chaos Magister's flagship, seeking to challenge him directly, to hunt him down in his domain and slay him. The Magister did not succeed in thwarting the Imperial General's ambitions. The boarding parties overwhelmed the Chaos Defenders, forcing the Magister to break away and attempt to flee. The moment he did, of course, the Hedwig fleet elements saw no further reason to continue fighting for this master, and began to shatter and flee themselves. Having escaped down to the planet, the Magister attempted to go to ground, but was hunted down by the General's elite contingents. The destroyer of Tarnith's life being claimed by General Urian's second-in-command, a man by the name of Langmauser. A peculiar name that does not in any way, of course, detract from his achievements. But perhaps the single most noteworthy event of these 2 years, at the very least from an inquisitorial perspective, was yet another failure of the Holy Ordos. This time on behalf of Ordo Hereticus, and in the form of Lilith Abfaqan. Another painful reminder that far too many Inquisitors do not have the determination necessary to quell their more suspicious protégés. As Lilith, originally the daughter of planetary nobility, quite early on in her career, demonstrated a suspicious level of fascination with the Eldar and such Xenos creatures. To begin with, granted, this fascination revolved primarily around how to stop them from breathing, an interest that every Imperial citizen should take up at some point in their lives. This was probably what allowed her to fly under the radar for so very long, until she eventually received her full Rosetta. But over time, the pure, honest, righteous emotion of hate was replaced by something far more insidious, disgusting, and subversive. Admiration, followed by a form of interest, and eventually a fondness, until our should-have-been failed acolyte, Lilith, turned into a Xenos sympathizer in thought and actions. I can only hope and pray to the God Emperor that whatever simpering, weak, sentimental fool raised this Inquisitor has by now found himself at the wrong end of a tyrannid breeding apparatus. Anywho, Lilith had been requested by Lord Militant General Buledin to accompany his forces to the world of Monthax. It was an unpopulated jungle world that the forces of Chaos had apparently taken an unusual level of interest in, and as the great enemy appeared to think the planet important, obviously the warriors of the God Emperor had to do so as well. And with the memory of engagements like Menaceoid Epsilon, which we covered last episode, fresh in mind, the Imperium wanted to know if this was another Chaos world. Thus, the Inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus's presence. Though she had quite early on gotten involved in other matters as well. Apparently, according to the papers, she had investigated a young member of the Tarnith First and Only, Bryn Milo. Or, technically, not even a member, as he was not a serving Imperial Guardsman, but rather he had been brought along with the regiment as the sole singular civilian survivor of the destruction of Tarnith, due to having been assigned to be Colonel Commissar Gaunt's guide. Apparently the Tarnith had some sort of weird tradition that all off-world guests had to be accompanied by a piper boy at all times, lest they get lost in the forest. Silly local superstition, of course, but anywho. Bryn Milo was suspected of being a latent or even active low-level psyker, due to his ability to fix the outcome of certain games during the various inter-regimental, leisure activities. Quite a few members of other regiments had apparently been defrauded by Milo and several other Tarnith soldiers who were running a rigged game. Now, apparently, the explanation to this rigged game was of a far more mundane origin than initially suspected. Apparently, the Tarnith had stolen, in all due likelihood, an Imperial sensor. Then they plugged up the holes in the sensor, threw in a bug, shook it around a little bit, and then unplugged the holes. Then the soldiers bet on which numbered hole the bug would emerge from. Whoever guessed either the hole itself or the hole closest to the bug's emerger would win. Seems simple enough, except the Tarnith seemed to be winning a lot more often than they were losing, and usually at strategically advantageous points in time, when the betting pool had grown particularly enticing. The explanation as to why they were doing so, however, appeared to be that the Tarnith smeared just a little bit of sugar on the opening that they desired the creature to emerge from. Simple. Easy enough. Well, again, this is another example of an Inquisitor being far too lax around those they deem to not be problematic enough, but I'll get to that at some later point. Anywho, Lilith, having already had interactions with the Tarnith First and Only, and knowing their expertise as scouts, elected to assign herself to them during the landing on Monthax. Shortly thereafter, after the Imperium had settled in, the Chaos Forces launched an enormous attack, led by armor and mass cultist troops, as if every strength available on the world had all organized into one sole singular enormous spearhead, heading towards nothing. Nothing whatsoever. It wasn't attacking any Imperial position of note, and what Imperial forces it did encounter seemed to be, well, in its way more so than targets. Growing suspicious, of course, Lilith and Imperial Command both decided to try and figure out what exactly the enemy was driving towards. The Tarnith joined up with elements of the Royal Volpone 50th on orders of the Inquisitor, and began their move towards what appeared to be the epicenter of the Chaos Force's attention, just as a titanic psychic storm broke over the planet and the area, causing general confusion and horror amongst the Imperial forces, and a fair few casualties as well, as it laid waste to enormous portions of the jungle, with gale force winds capable of shattering tree trunks. Becoming scattered due to the ferocity of the storm, the Tarnith and the Volpone were intermingled, and though they did continue to push forward, were scattered horribly so, and seemed unlikely to be able to do anything to the vast Chaos Horde, except they arrived to find something highly unusual. Many members of the Tarnith Thirst found themselves back on Tarnith Magna, the capital, defending it against invading Chaos forces. Unusual? Very unusual. As if some vast psychic force was acting upon the minds of the Tarnith. Because, of course, it was. The thing that had caught the Chaos Force's attention was an Eldar stronghold surrounding an entry to the Webway. This stronghold was guarded by one of their kind's seers, a high-ranking member of their craftworlds by the name of Eon Kul of Craftworld Doltha. This Webway gate led directly to the heart of his craftworld. An incredible vulnerability that had remarkably been allowed to remain open, perhaps due to some form of sentimental attachment to Monthax. Perhaps the planet had once been one of their virgin worlds. Regardless of the reason, this Webway was now a gargantuan vulnerability. Chaos loves Eldar souls more than it does almost anything else, and here was an opening to pour into an entire craftworld. Not merely just to kill the Eldar within, but the possibility of breaking in to their infinity vaults, and to shatter the soul stones of God Emperor alone knows how many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of Eldar. Such an act would probably be enough to earn whoever managed to carry it out demonhood. It was therefore not too much of a surprise that the Chaos forces on the world had thrown everything at this Eldar stronghold, and that the Eldar in turn had carried out every trick in the book in order to try and dupe the Imperial forces to fight for them against the Chaos invaders. However, having been unable to ensnare enough aid, the Seer had also unleashed the Psychic Storm, which was now doing about as much damage to his allies as to the enemy, as yet again, the arrogance of the Eldar has no equal. The Seer was not able to control his psychic powers. The storm ran out of control and threatened to end his misbegotten kind, the Imperial Defenders, and the Chaos Forces altogether. Unfortunately, Lilith's misguided sympathies saw her fight alongside the Tarnith and the Vulpan Bluebloods, urging them to side with the Eldar against Chaos. An action of expediency that could perhaps be forgiven, but she even then, worse still, she allowed the Eldar to evacuate. Then finished closing the Webway gate, and she even joined them. Make no mistake, Lilith Abfaqan is a traitor to the Imperium, and should have been treated as such immediately. The fact that the Colonel Commissar allowed her to leave... a black mark on his record, at the very least. But once more, the Colonel Commissar avoided too much in the way of censure, as he was guided not by any mistaken sympathy for the Eldar, but rather by far more understandable male sympathies, as I hear that Lilith Abfaqan was not only quite the comely individual, but also very persuasive. The good Colonel Commissar thus was not guilty of trucking with the enemy, with the Xenos, but rather being misled by his private parts. A weakness, but not one that the Inquisition is likely to be able to eradicate from the human condition anytime soon. And as a result of all of this nonsense, the Chaos Forces were obliterated, and the Eldar, well, there wasn't any overt remaining evidence of their activity, and the only person who could have conclusively proven and acted upon the fact that several members of the Imperial Guard were brain-fucked by the Xenos witches also disappeared along with them. All in all, the bother required to pursue action against the Tarnith, the Volpin 50th, and against Lord Militant General Buledin for placing his trust in such questionable individuals would quite simply not justify the effort. See, we're not all bulls charging through a china shop. Some of us Inquisitors know when to apply a little bit of discretion. The only problem is, as has been demonstrated now yet again, some Inquisitors employ far too much discretion. And I really wish this would be the last time the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition would be dragged through the mud of this conflict. But no, we're not quite there yet. Anywho, thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.